As I mentioned, we're on this road trip series, Hit the Road with Jesus, and we've been playing road trip music before worship. Last week we had On the Road Again by Willie Nelson. Today we're evidently going to hear more than once, moving right along from the Muppet movie. As we talked about Hit the Road with Jesus, I suggested the song Hit the Road, Jack. The problem is it's not actually a road tripping song, it's a song about a relationship. As we hit the road with Jesus, he travels around and we find that he meets all kinds of people. Last week he met 10 lepers, one who was a Samaritan, an outsider. Jesus healed all 10 of them, but only the Samaritan came back to give thanks to him. Elizabeth shared so wonderfully about how we are called to be people of gratitude, like that person whom the religious people of Jesus' time would have considered an outsider. We're talking about hitting the road with Jesus and all the different kinds of people that he meets because we are focusing this year on the end of our vision statement, which says that we want to do ministry with everyone. Remember, our vision statement is joyfully reaching out to share God's love and faith in Jesus with everyone. Today, that everyone includes a blind man. Bob told the story. Barb retold it. Let me retell it really quickly once again. There's a blind man sitting by the side of the road. Jesus is walking along. There's a crowd following him. This blind man hears the commotion and asks what's happening. And the people say, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And so this man decides to call out to Jesus. The crowd tries to silence him, stop him from bothering this very important person. But he won't be stopped, and he calls out even more. So Jesus stops and says, "Bring the man to me." They bring him, and Jesus has this close conversation with this man. "What do you want me to do?" he asks. The man says, "I want to see." Jesus says, "Go, because your faith has healed you." This man is blind, and so last week we heard about the Samaritan who came back, and we talked about the fact that the Samaritan is an outsider, and this blind man is also, as was accurately identified in children's time, is also an outsider. His very blindness makes him an outsider because the assumption of Jesus' time was that if you had some sort of disability like that it was caused by sin. You were imperfect, and so you were unlovable by God. This applied to all kinds of things. If you had animals that were born with deformities, you could not offer them as sacrifices to God. You could use them in other ways. You could potentially still consume them yourselves, but you were required to make offerings to God, and you could not offer an imperfect animal to God because God is perfect and God does not accept imperfect things. And this was true of human beings as well. If you weren't born perfect, then God would never accept you because you had been made that way and somehow you weren't good enough for God. Luke, who we read this morning, doesn't give this blind man a name. But this is one of those stories that is told in all three of what we call the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means that they have the same view. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the three synoptic gospels. They tell the story of Jesus in fairly similar ways. And this is one of those stories that appears in all three of them. In Mark, this man has a name. He's called Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus is an interesting name because it's partly Jewish, because that word bar means son of. Anytime you hear bar in the Bible, it means son of, and then you follow whatever it is after that. The problem is that Bar Jonah would have made sense because Jonah was a Hebrew name. Bar Jesus would have made sense because Jesus is a Jewish name. But Timaeus is a Greek name. So we have this man who's carrying a somewhat Jewish name because it's Bar, meaning son of, but the name afterward is Greek, which means that he's most likely also an outsider in more than just his blindness. His family evidently is Greek in background. Maybe he's a convert to Judaism. But Timaeus itself is an interesting name as well because in Greek it has its roots, most scholars agree, meaning honor. And so this man, Bartimaeus in Mark, is called son of honor. Maybe Luke drops the name because he finds that that's too good of a name to call this man son of honor. Maybe he simply wants to drive home the message that this man really is an outsider, and to give him a name, in some senses, welcomes him into the community, right? If he's nameless, then we don't have to deal with him. Maybe Luke doesn't want him unidentified as son of honor because there's so much dishonor heaped upon him in this story. Regardless, Luke doesn't give him a name. Matthew, just in case you're really interested to know how these synoptic gospels work, when Matthew tells this story, it's an unnamed person again, but it becomes two men who are blind by the side of the road. All of these gospel writers tell the story just in slightly different ways in order to meet their community's needs of how to understand Jesus. Mark gives him a name, Luke doesn't. Matthew makes it two men who are nameless. But what's clear in all three of those stories is that Jesus does indeed do ministry with everyone, whether they have a name in the Bible or not, whether they are someone with honor or not. And in each of these stories, the thing that is the same is this astounding thing that Jesus says, your faith has healed you. And it's astounding because, remember, this man, according to the times, is a sinner. How is it that he can have faith that heals? We are to understand something here. We are to understand that this man, even though the world labels him as a sinner and says he's imperfect, he's not good enough for God, that he is the one who has real faith. There are all these people following him around, following Jesus around. And we would initially think they're the faithful ones, but they're the ones that act out here. They rebuke the man and yell at him and try to keep him away from Jesus, betraying their faith. And instead, this man by the side of the road whom the world has discounted, he has real faith. Outsiders can have real faith. We have a tendency to believe that it's only the people who are here. We talk negatively about people who don't come to church, who don't worship, and want to push them outside just like this blind man is. Our response to people like this blind man, it's where I started this morning. We say, hit the road, Jack. Get out of here. But do you hear what Jesus says today? The scripture said that Jesus ordered them to bring him to him. This is another difference in the way the story is told. In Mark, this blind man has a name, and when what Jesus says is, come to me, and this blind man gets up and walks toward Jesus. But Luke changes the story and says, Jesus told the people who had just been yelling at this man to stay quiet and stay out of things, that Jesus orders them instead to bring the man to him. And Jesus makes the same order to us. Bring them to me. We're so good at driving people away. We have this vision statement with this grand idea of doing ministry with everyone. But if we were truly doing ministry with everyone, this place would be full of people. Instead, we are really good at finding tiny ways to tell people to hit the road. This man, this blind man, he says the right thing. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's saying the right thing. This phrase means that he's identifying Jesus as the Messiah. This is something that many of these people that are following Jesus may not have even done yet. He says the right, faithful thing, and still they try to keep him quiet. We get angry when people say and do things opposed to the gospel, but we frequently try to shut out people who are even doing faithful things because we figure that we know better than they do. Jesus only orders them to bring him to him. It's not our job to figure out whether people are worthy or not of coming to Jesus. Our job is to follow this order. Bring them to me. But we'd rather be the ones who decide who's in and who's out. But we have this vision statement, ministry with everyone, and Jesus says, bring them to me. When we read this story, we all want to believe that we're the blind man. But the reality is that we are more often the crowd. We're following Jesus, and that's the right thing to do. But somewhere along the way, we've gotten confused about what Jesus is really all about. We're getting our needs met by Jesus, but we forget that Jesus still wants to do ministry with everyone. We forget that there are others that would like to follow Jesus as well. And rather than help them, we hinder them. We hinder in lots of ways. We hinder people in the ways that we treat one another. Our church is going through and I don't mean this congregation, I mean the United Methodist Church is going through a great divide right now. And it's hard. I think ultimately it will be a good thing because it's surrounding issues that have divided our church for over 40 years, and we've looked ugly as we've fought with one another, and it has hurt our witness to Jesus Christ in the world. And perhaps if we finally separate ourselves, we can stop the fighting. My worry, though, is that we're amping up our vitriol as we divide and fighting even harder than we ever did before. And it just continues to hinder others from coming to Jesus. We hinder others from coming to Jesus in the ways that we vie for power within the church. We want to have our position, our authority, our control, forgetting that we are following Jesus, but we've maybe forgotten that for him, power looks very different. Power is letting the authorities arrest you, nail you to a cross, and kill you. That's what power looks like in the kingdom. We hinder people in the ways that we like to stick to what's comfortable, our favorite seat, the favorite way in which we do worship, the friends that we want to see on Sunday morning so that we forget to say hello to the new people who are in our midst. We're comfortable. We're following Jesus. But we maybe have forgotten in the midst of following him what he's really all about, which is reaching out to everyone. We hinder people from coming to Jesus in the ways that we talk about the world, labeling those outside the church as bad, as errant, as lost. There are times when Jesus does lament the state of the world, but when he does it in a caring way. One of the things that Jesus says is, "Oh, Jerusalem, how I wish I could gather you up under my wings like a mother hen does to protect its little chicks who don't know how to protect themselves." He laments that Jerusalem has sort of lost their way, but what he does is says, "I want to care for you." We instead talk negatively about the world and we have no care in our voice. If I hear one more person say to me, "Pastor, isn't the world just getting worse and worse?" I don't know what I will do. You know what I say every single time? If you've ever said it, you know. Read your Bible. The world has always been bad. It's not worse. You're maybe more aware of it. But even that betrays our faithfulness because we're more aware of the bad things going on in the world, and yet rather than being helpers that Jesus calls us to be, we've become the Eeyores of the world. Oh, bother. Isn't the world getting bad? We better sit in our safe church and not do anything to try to change it. But Jesus says, bring him to me. He orders this man to be brought to him. Can we stop for a moment? I didn't know that Barb was going to make us imagine. She stole my sermon. But I want us to imagine what this is like. If Jesus said, help that blind person come to me, what would you do? I'm not asking you a rhetorical question. I want you to answer. Yeah, how would you help? You'd have to touch this person, most likely. I mean, you might ask first. We don't touch people without asking first. But you would say, Jesus ordered you to be brought. Can I help you up? Can I guide you to him? We are able to figure out how to help this blind man get to Jesus. Certainly, we can figure out how to bring others to Jesus and be in ministry to everyone. But often we act as if we need to have a master's class to do it. Anytime we challenge people to share about their faith, what do we say? I don't know how to do that, Pastor. Oh, what if, they have a negative reaction to me? What would I say? We have all kinds of excuses. If I could just learn more. Maybe we want it to be simple. Sure, Pastor, I'll share my faith. Can you give me a pamphlet that I can just hand to somebody? No. Do you think that the people who Jesus said, bring that man to me, do you think they went over to this man and handed him a pamphlet about how to get to Jesus? Or did they go over to him and say, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to stand up and start walking. And you'll find Jesus. No, they of course touched him. They took him by the hand. And they led him toward Jesus. They entered into a relationship with this man whom they had just recently been having a very different kind of relationship with. They had been yelling at him. The word actually today in the NIV that we read is that they rebuked him and told him to be quiet. Rebuke is a really strong word, in case you don't know. I yell at my daughter a lot because I just do. I learned it from my mom. But I don't rebuke her very often. That has a different connotation. The crowd has been trying to prevent him to get to Jesus, and ultimately what Jesus forces them to do, it says he orders them to bring him to me. You can see probably them arguing with Jesus at first. He says, bring him to me. Oh, you don't want that guy, right, Jesus? You must be confused. He has to order them to bring him to him. And what happens is they ultimately have to get close to this man. They've tried to stay far away. As they're rebuking him, the most that they might have done, because he is a sinner and he's unclean and you cannot come into contact with him, you might have raised your hand, right, as a threat. Stop talking or we'll do something about it, right? They may have threatened him, but now Jesus makes them touch him and get close. And then Jesus does the same thing. Do you notice the beauty of this story? There's this crowd. We're immediately told that there's this crowd. And then he orders them to bring the man to him. And suddenly the crowd falls away. We never hear about them ever again. It's just Jesus and this man. They're together. And they have this personal conversation. We have to be able to make relationships with people and let the hindrances that we love to hold on to prevent people from getting there fall away. We have to decide if we will continue to be a hindrance or if we will truly share faith in Jesus with everyone. And it may mean building new relationships with people that we have previously hurt, offended, hindered from coming to Jesus. It's a big commitment. It would be easier if our vision statement ended with, joyfully reaching out and to share God's love and faith in Jesus with people that we like, right? Or joyfully reaching out to share God's love and faith in Jesus with people who are like us. I don't even know that the crowd thought that they were hindering this man. We sometimes aren't even aware that we're doing it. They were just following the rules. He's a sinner. He's imperfect. He doesn't get to come to God. But this is what God always does. Throws things out the window of what we expect and says, I want to do a new thing. I want to reach new people. I want to change the way we've always done things. They thought they were being faithful. But God works in unexpected ways. Friends, we regularly keep people from Jesus if we're honest with ourselves, and we may not even realize that we're doing it because we are thinking, I'm following the rules. But sometimes we have to stop and ask ourselves, are we hindering people from reaching Jesus? You'll notice, I hope, in the 6 years that I have preached to you, that I always say we. I don't ever say you need to do this. Because I also have hindered people from getting to Jesus. I do it unconsciously. I hopefully don't do it consciously. I'm a pastor, but I undoubtedly have assumptions about who can and cannot come to God. But if we are truly passionate about doing ministry with everyone, then we need to learn to question our assumptions about who it is that can come towards Jesus. And if they are calling out, especially like this man is, we should not stop them. We should help them get to him because Jesus orders it. Bring them to me. And it will mean doing ministry with lots of different kinds of people. That's kind of what everyone means, right? Bring everyone to me, Jesus says. It'll be like John Wesley, who tried to do ministry within the church that he was a part of, and at some point he had friends who said to him, you keep getting thrown out of churches when you go to preach, because they didn't like what he was preaching. Wesley was like, what am I going to do? I have to preach in a church. And his friends were like, why? Just go out into the streets and preach. And he said, no, a preacher would never do that. That's terrible. But one day, he was a journal keeper. Anytime you need to fall asleep, read Wesley's journals. He would write down everything he ate and every single thing he did each day. This is why we're called Methodists. He was definitely in order. But one day, he said, I have decided to become more vile. I love this phrase. And what it is he wrote it when he had decided that he was going to go out and preach in the streets. I have decided to become more vile, because that's what he thought of these preachers that were out there in the streets. Ooh, they are vile people. This is what this crowd thinks of this blind man. He is vile. But he decided to become more vile, and suddenly the Methodist movement was born. Yes, the people in the churches didn't like what he was preaching, but the people out in the streets needed to hear what he was preaching. And if we want to do ministry with everyone, we can't do things the way we've always done them. We have to try new things and reach out to people whom we might consider vile. And we ourselves may need to become vile. I hope, as I move on, and I hear about the reports of Goodrich United Methodist Church, that I never once hear people say, that is such a respectable church. I hope instead that what I hear is Goodrich United Methodist Church is a church willing to do the messy work of actually sharing Jesus with everyone. Going and touching the people whom we would never touch because they're outside of God's love according to the rules. And saying, you know what? Sometimes Jesus just wants to break the religious rules and reach everyone. Amen.